Okay, well now, welcome everybody to the special call meeting, work session to discuss the proposed 2021 budget. And just want to let everybody know that this work session will be no motions, no votes. This is strictly an session to gather information. And of course, after the presentation by Buddy, we'll all open the floor to questions by the commissioners, okay? Just to let everybody also know that the first public hearing for this budget hearing will be tomorrow at the 9 o'clock meeting. And then we have a public schedule for the remaining 2 hearings. So with that, Buddy, you have the floor.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Chairman, Commissioners, County Manager, I'm here to present the FY21 proposed budget. But before I start the presentation, I just want to give some thank yous real quick, if I may. I want to thank the board for your time. I know you all are incredibly busy, but the last 2 weeks we were able to grab a bit of your time to kind of go over the major assumptions and objectives of this budget. So again, I appreciate your time. I also want to thank the budget staff in coordinating this process, and especially with the new system of OpenGov. They were critical in running communication between departments, and I appreciate their efforts. I also appreciate the IS team, who, it being a new software, was critical and integral in getting the new budget up and running, so that I want to thank them. I also want to thank every single department out here who had a representative working with the OpenGov software. It's always new, it's always a challenge, but they hung in there, and it was actually a really good introduction to a new budgeting tool. So we appreciate all of that. So again, as the chairman reiterated, this is July's schedule for the budget. We have our advertisement, which will be, this budget will be advertised in the MDJ tomorrow. We'll have the first public hearing in this room tomorrow at 9 a.m. 1 week later, we will have the second public hearing. It's a special called work session at 6:30. We'll have the third and final public hearing and adoption in this room at our regular meeting at July 28th at 7 o'clock. The schedule you see in front of you, along with the advertisement, complies with all state laws and county codes as it pertains to adopted budgets. So we're in compliance from that perspective. Now, before we get into the numbers, I want to take a brief moment to kind of walk through the narrative. This is a review of what we talked about the past couple of weeks. But again, this is kind of the general assumption that we had to take for the FY21 budget and its preparation. It goes without saying that we're in unprecedented times, surrounded by uncertainty, and whether the recovery is going to be the V-shape, a long drawn-out recovery, a lot is yet to be seen. And with those assumptions, we have to take a very conservative approach to the FY21 budget. So on the revenue side, we're assuming a flat millage rate in our FY21 budget. We are also assuming a flat digest growth for FY21. And to give you some context, in FY19, we budgeted net digest growth of 3.5%, and we had a 3.4% net digest growth budgeted in FY20. Again, this year, we're projecting a flat tax digest. We are continuing this board's objective of reducing the water transfer. And FY20 was the first year of this most recent cycle that we dropped it from 10% to 9%. We're continuing that in the FY21 budget by reducing it from 9% to 8%. Two other major revenue sources within the general fund that were impacted and may continue to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic are fines and forfeitures and licensing and permits. So in fines and forfeitures, we're budgeting a $1.7 million reduction. Again, this revenue source has been declining recently, but the COVID pandemic, we believe, and we're seeing, is accelerating that decline with continued court disruptions and traffic citation disruptions. From a license and permitting side, we're budgeting a decline in both commercial and residential permits, and that's what's making up the $910,000 reduction there. On the expenditure side, we're going to be continuing the county-wide restricted hiring process that began this spring. This budget includes no new positions. It does continue the priority of the chair and this board by having another step for public safety in March of 21. Last year in March of 2020, the board established a stepping grade. This is a continuation of that plan awarded 1 year after the last step. This budget calls for an increase in pension cost and healthcare cost. And one of the largest changes in the general fund budget was a reduction in our capital expenditures. Again, this is the narrative. I hope it helps as we walk through the numbers to add a little bit of meat to the bone. So here's our general fund revenues. Overall, the general fund revenue budget declined by $1.8 million from a budgetary perspective. You'll see property taxes increased 3.5, but if you recall, in the assumptions, we assumed a flat millage rate and a flat digest. So that's not contributing to that property tax increase. What you're seeing there is a result of the state's change in TABT allocations. July of 2019, they changed the share between the state and local municipalities, which caused an increase in our TABT revenue, and that was done after our FY20 adopted budget. So we had to include it in our FY21 budget to reflect the actuals. So the growth you're seeing there is based on TABT growth. We have a $705,000 increase budget in other taxes. That's our insurance premium tax. Again, you'll see the $910,000 reduction in licenses and permits. You'll see the $1.7 million reduction, again, for our fines and forfeitures. And at the bottom in the last category, you'll see a $3.1 million reduction in transfers. Again, that's the reduction of the water rate from the 9% to the 8%. All in all, it's a $1.8 million reduction in general fund revenues. Being that we have to present a balanced budget, general fund expenditures are also budgeted to decline $1.8 million. Now, personnel services increased approximately $20 million. Again, this budget does not include any new personnel. However, it also includes increases to pension and healthcare costs. But the main driver of the increase was related to the merit increases of the 7% for certified and sworn personnel and 4% for all other personnel. And to illustrate this, if you wouldn't mind taking a look at the contingency change, you had a $15 million change there. Now, we'll get into the details on the next slide, but if you recall, we had the budgeted contingencies for the 7% and the 4%, nearly $13 million was in the contingency account in FY20. Well, when we award that, it goes into the salaries column. So you're seeing a shift from contingency to personnel. So I just want to kind of show you the change related to the merit and the change in contingency and the change in personnel. We had a $2.2 million increase, budgeted increase in operating expenditures. That's nearly 2.3%. That comes from utilities, contracts, and maintenance. Our capital, to reiterate, that was the largest reduction. We had to reduce that in order to balance the general fund based on all the assumptions we had to make. The $2.1 million that remains in FY20 is $1 million budgeted for the sheriff's office, $1 million for PD, and $150,000 for the district attorney's office renovation. We actually need for additional office space within the district attorney's building, not her office per se. Debt service remains flat. As a reminder, that is the stadium debt service. Transfers out increased $3.7 million. Again, this relates back to TABT. Part of that law change in July of 19 instructed the tax commissioner's office to send all of the TABT proceeds to the county's general fund. Previously, the general fund was getting a portion, the fire fund was getting a portion, and the debt service fund was getting a portion. So this board took action in FY20 once we found out that all of those funds would be going to the general fund. The board and Bill presented an item to transfer out the funds that would have gone to the fire fund to the general fund, being an agenda item. We had to adopt that transfer as part of FY21's budget. That's the increase. We're taking the TABT funds that would have gone to fire normally, and we're transferring from the general fund to the fire fund, making them whole. And here's the contingency. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But overall, again, reduced general fund expenditure budget of $1.8 million. So again, the major changes are up top. And you'll see there were the 4% merit for non-certified and non-sworn employees, and the 7% merit for certified and sworn employees. Those are not in the 21 proposed budget, so they went away. We, in order to balance the budget, removed police's operating and capital contingency of $2 million. They were awarded that $1 million in capital. The remaining contingencies are standard contingency items that are adopted by this board on an annual basis in our adopted budget. Here's our stadium bond debt service breakout. So you can see the difference between FY20 and FY21, and the biggest change here relates to COVID-19. Hotel motel revenues have been incredibly impacted because of the occupancy rates. We've seen them drop tremendously since the pandemic began. And as such, we cannot right now, in good faith, budget any dollars, any excess hotel motel funds to go towards the stadium debt. We're making up the difference, though, by transferring additional monies from CSSD1 and CSSD2. The general fund did pick up a little extra of the debt service than it did in years prior, but I do want to commit to this board that if we receive stronger than expected hotel motel revenues as we go throughout FY21, we will certainly reevaluate it, bring it to your attention, and if any excess hotel motel revenues do exist, we'll allocate them towards stadium bond debt with this board's approval, thereby reducing the general fund's component towards stadium debt. There we go. So these are the governmental fund types within the county. I'm going to hit some of the highlights. I'm not going to go through each of the funds, but I want to talk about the claims fund. It went up $7.7 million. Again, when we budget for healthcare premiums to increase throughout the county, we're a self-insured medical system within the county, at least in terms of the way we're set up in our funds. So when we have an increase in health insurance premiums, those go to the claims funds to cover future expenditures. And that's the increase for the $7.7 million. The fire fund, this is in a very similar situation to the general fund in regards to the assumptions. We're assuming a flat digest. We're assuming a flat millage rate. They were impacted by merit. They were impacted by step and grade. They were impacted by pension. The fire fund was impacted by healthcare. But the one thing, and we had to remove all their capital. But the one thing that makes them different is we had to go even further on the fire fund and reduce their operating budget by an additional $2 million just to get them to balance at their final FY21 proposed budget of $102.4 million. And now, arguably, the two funds most impacted by COVID are also on this slide. As I mentioned earlier, we have the hotel motel tax fund. It's budgeted $9.9 million. We budgeted this fund to be sufficient to cover our PAC bond. So if receipts come in higher over the course of FY21, we'll certainly reassess the situation with this board, and that would allow us to commit any excess funds to stadium debt. However, the opposite is so true. If hotel motel revenues do not improve and we cannot reach that budget of $9.9 million, we will have to come back in front of this board and potentially entertain a general fund subsidy to cover the Performing Arts Center bonds. But again, we're in a wait-and-see approach. We've seen some recovery. We just have to see what the first half of the year brings and how our economy goes in our beginning of our first half of 21. And again, CSSD1, another fund that was impacted by occupancy rates. It's a $3 room night fee. If they see lowered occupancy, we have to project a lower budget. And you'll see the reduction there of $960,000. These are our business type funds. Transit had an increase of nearly $5 million. The increase was based on increased operator service fees. However, they were also awarded CARES grant funds that was separate from the 132 allocation we received. It was a separate $18 million allocation. They've committed to using $5 to $6 million per year for the next 3 years in that fund. So that's what's accounting for the increase in transit. We also have the water fund, which is supported by water rates. The increases in their expenditure side comes from increased cost of chemicals, water purchases, and sludge handling fees.
We're seeing another increase in solid waste. Is that for landfill closing costs?
Partially, ma'am. Part of it is because of landfill post-closure, but we did have to reduce that budget. Part of it is the $185,000 contingency that the board approved last year for Keep Cobb Beautiful. It moved over from the general fund into the solid waste operations and for the personnel budget. So that's part of that increase, is that $185,000 that moved from the general fund. And if I may, without confusing the group, let me go back to the contingency slide. You'll see fifth from the bottom, you'll see the Keep Cobb Beautiful contingency at $187.5. We're adopting zero in the general fund because we've already made that transfer. It's now over in the solid waste fund. And that's where it's going to remain. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
Yeah, but can you go back a slide?
Yes, ma'am. Try to.
The slide where you were.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So again, those are the business type funds of the county. You have any other questions, ma'am? Okay, perfect. These are the capital funds of the county's budget. The stadium capital maintenance fund, again, I would like to remind this board that it's 50% funded by the county and 50% funded by the Braves. So the county's contribution in FY21 will be $1.32 million. The Braves will be funding the other half of the stadium capital maintenance. We have the capital projects fund, which is funded from other interfund transfers from other operating funds within the county. It goes to pay for things such as the PC and printer replacement leases, GIS, you name it. Anyone who uses those systems pays in for it, such as water, fire, or the general fund. Then we have the water capital funds, which are the RE&I fund and the system development fee funds. We had a $5 million increase in both of those. One was a pass-through to the other, and the expenditure increase for the system development fee was mainly based on treatment plants and sewer projects. But before I conclude the presentation, open up for questions, I just want to talk about future actions. I want to remind everyone that we do have the first public hearing again tomorrow at 9 a.m. We have the second public hearing a week later at 6:30, the special called work session in this room. And we have the third and final public hearing followed by the adoption on July 28th at 7 o'clock at a regularly scheduled meeting. And one thing that's different than the first slide that I want to reiterate here is we are being conservative in our collection rate for FY20. We assume that our collection rate, which is normally about 97%, would be about 94, 95%. And that's for this upcoming year of tax collection. Once we get all the tax receipts in, and we will probably get a good idea of how we ended the year by January 21. We'll commit to this board that we'll come and look at the year-end fiscal 20 results. And if it ends better than we anticipate, then any of the capital that we had to remove in order to balance the budget will be reevaluated by this board. And we have a list of all the capital items that were removed that we can provide you with. So this board has a copy of that. But with that, the summary again was a conservative budget, and we'll have to wait and see on how the recovery goes. But with that, I'll end the presentation and open up for your questions.
Commissioner Hott.
I don't really have any questions. I just want to thank Buddy and Bill and Jackie for all the hard work. You guys did a great job when you walked the halls and kind of went through it. So I'm good.
Thank you, sir.
No questions.
Appreciate that.
Commissioner Cupid.
No questions.
Thank you,
Commissioner
ma'am.
Burrow. Okay, Commissioner Gamble. Okay, we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.